Welcome to our talk this evening. Our speaker is Augustine McKibbon, who is the great niece of Blanche Augustine of Wainfleet, who was a Canadian nurse in an army hospital in France during World War I. Anne is going to tell us Blanche's story based on the diaries that she kept. And put her experiences in the context of contributions of Canadian nurses and other healthcare professionals and the efforts they made to help the war. And I'm just going to unleash you, I guess, and let you go. If you have any questions in the meantime, please, by all means, type them into the chat to me directly. I'm Amanda. Or to the Ontario Ancestors, the co-host on the screen. And I'm going to let you go. Thanks, Anne.
Okay, just before you, as you say, unleash me, how much time are you, yes, how long is my leash in minutes?
We have an hour.
1 hour, okay. I will go through these. Interrupt me if you have questions. I sometimes have verbal dyslexia, so I may not say exactly what I think I'm saying. So if something sounds strange, question me for sure. Okay, let's get started. This is a picture of my great aunt, Aunt Blanche. This picture was taken in France. She was with the US Army. And yeah, but let's start a little bit further back than that. So now I just have to. There we go. This is what I want to do for this afternoon, this evening, talk about the background. And most of the time I'm going to spend talking about when she was in France, and she arrived in December 17th and she left in February 19th. And then she came home, and yeah, we'll get to that for sure. So this is where it all started. This letter arrived to my mother back in 1979, 9 years after my aunt died. It contained her diary from the time she was in France. It was sent by her best friend, and we had no idea it existed. So my mother put it away in 1979, and we didn't discover it until about 2001 when we were going through my parents' papers. So this was a big surprise. I decided to transcribe it because it talked about a very strong woman in our family. And I'm a firm believer that we women need to know more about strong women in our backgrounds. Okay, this is a picture of Aunt Blanche and my grandfather, Harold, in Wainfleet in 1890. So they were 5 and 2. And they were not the first children in the family. They were actually the 3rd and the 4th children. The first 2 children died of diphtheria. And their mother was, I think, very much affected by the deaths of these older sons. And that had a tremendous impact on where Aunt Blanche went from there. So this is a farmhouse where they grew up, where I grew up, but there were 6 generations of us. This is in Long Beach, in Wainfleet. For those of you who know Wainfleet, not very far from DJ's. The family farm, we moved there in 1848. And as you can see, for those of you who don't know Wainfleet, it's right on Lake Erie, right at the top point of the star is where the farm was. Now, this is where she went to nursing school. This is the Millard Fillmore Hospital in Buffalo. My great grandmother didn't want Aunt Blanche to leave home. She wanted her to stay home and help on the farm. But Aunt Blanche said, no, I need to get away. And I'm not going to St. Catharines, I'm going to Buffalo. St. Catharines had one of the very first nursing schools in all of Canada. But Aunt Blanche decided to go a little bit further afield. She went to Buffalo, and this is where she got her training. There were 10 graduates in her class, and actually, I think 8 of them ended up going to the hospital in Buffalo when the time came. So a little bit about the Great War. You all probably know a fair bit about the war. Everyone thought that the war would be over by Christmas 1914. And the British really firmly believed that. So if you were a doctor or a dentist and you volunteered to go in the war, they sent you to the trenches. They didn't necessarily save you for the hospitals. They just sent everyone. So by the time the US entered the war, there were very few physicians and there were far more casualties. So when the US entered the war, their greatest need was they needed money, they needed soldiers, and they asked for doctors and nurses and dentists. But the Americans said, we're not going to send you our doctors and nurses. We want to have some sort of control over what's going on. So we're going to send you whole hospitals. We're going to a lot of the cities in the States, especially the ones with medical schools, would collect a whole hospital of doctors and nurses and x-ray machines and bedpans and spoons and forks, everything that would be put together to form a hospital was sent from a city in the United States. And actually Canada sent some too. Kitchener-Waterloo, I think, sent a hospital. Toronto sent a couple. Kingston sent a hospital. And a tremendous number of lives lost in the war. So yes, I think I've already said a fair bit of that. Yeah, the army only paid for salaries of the people there. The cities paid for everything else that went. These hospitals were designed to be equipped for about 500 patients, but often they had almost 2,000 patients. And if you want to compare, say, Canada comparison, even Ottawa, which has a huge set of hospital complexes, has fewer than 1,800 beds. So these were huge hospitals, and they weren't all that staffed, at least in comparison to what we know as a fully staffed hospital. Yeah, I've already talked about this, but this is just a partial list of everything that went into sending those whole hospitals over to France. And here's one of the few pictures I could find. The Pierce Aero Company, or the Pierce Company in Buffalo, manufactured cars and trucks. And here, these are the ambulances that the Pierce folks gave to be sent over to France. And they certainly don't look like our ambulances now, but there we go. Those are some of the doctors that were going over in the ambulances that got sent. So this is the staff that got sent to the hospital. There were majors, captains, and lieutenants. They were the doctors and dentists. Dentists were incredibly important in the war because so much shrapnel would come down. There were a tremendous number of facial injuries. They only sent 62 nurses, 132 enlisted men, the orderlies, the people who worked in the kitchens, et cetera, et cetera. So the total staff was only 241, and the amount raised wasn't much over $100,000. I can't imagine $100,000 where that would go for a hospital in today's day. Yeah, here's my comparison with the Ottawa hospitals. You can see that the Ottawa hospital a few years ago, all of the hospitals in Ottawa only have less than 1,400 beds, but they have almost 12,000 staff compared to 241. And you can see the base hospital in Vital, where Aunt Blanche went. There were only 62 nurses, but it was 4,362 nurses in Ottawa. So tremendously different hospital setup. And actually, a lot of nurses did volunteer to go. This was working in one of these hospitals was considered a really plum job. You had to be 25 to 40 in good mental and physical health. You had to be fully trained in a hospital with more than 50 beds. It was also a good idea if you weren't married. Some women who were married lied about it and got sent over, but they really preferred single women. And a lot of the nurses that got sent to France and the Buffalo Hospital in the US hospitals actually were Canadian. And a good number of Aunt Blanche's graduating class went with her. And here a picture of two cousins. They're on the beach in Long Beach. Aunt Blanche is the shorter of the two, or the one looks shorter. She went with the US Army, and quite often the US Army paid much better than the Canadian Army when it came to nurses. The woman with her is Emma Augustine. She's also from Wainfleet, and she went with the Canadian Army. And she was making $10 a month. Aunt Blanche was making $50 a month as a nurse in the US hospital. And just as an aside, one of the women that went with Aunt Blanche over to Vitel, France was Edith Anderson. I don't know if you know her history, but she's from Six Nations, and she was the very first RN who was an Indigenous woman. So she would lose her status as an Indian if she was educated beyond high school in Canada. So she applied to a nursing school in New York State and graduated. She actually graduated first in her class. When she came back from the war, she went back to Six Nations. I actually talked to one of her sons when I was doing research for this project. She lived to be 103, and she helped form the hospital that was on the reserve and was the midwife. So she's one of Canadians' heroes who actually went with Aunt Blanche over to France. There's this is a map of France just to show you where she was. She was very close to Nancy. Nancy is a very important area. It's Alsace-Lorraine, so there's lots of coal, there's lots of iron ore. So both sides of the war really wanted to capture this area, really important in making munitions and steel, etc., war paraphernalia. This is just a line of the trench warfare. You can see the gray sort of line. It really didn't move much. And where the yellow arrow is where Aunt Blanche's hospital was in Vitel. It's actually the hospital that was the furthest east. Most of the rest of the hospitals, both the Canadian and the American hospitals were closer to England. So now we're on to the diary. So it starts the day she left Buffalo, the end of the summer, August 29. It lasts for 20 months. And I actually have direct quotes from the diary. I think direct quotes to me are more important than a description of it. So whenever you see italics, these are direct quotes. Okay, they left Buffalo. This was the end of August. On the train, very restless night. They had breakfast at the depot. And then the nurses were taken to Ellis Island, and that's where they were headquartered. Ellis Island, actually, I think there's a picture of it next. Yes, here's Ellis Island. You can see the building with the spires. That's where the boats came in with the immigrants. And if you were healthy and passed all of the requirements, you got on a boat, and you can see the little black boats, and they would take you across to Buffalo. If they wanted to keep you, or you weren't quite healthy, they put the immigrants in the hospitals. And the hospitals are that row of buildings that are closest to the bottom of the picture. But of course, by the time the First World War was on, there were very few immigrants coming. So these hospital buildings were empty. So the nurses that were being sent overseas were billeted in these hospitals. And there's another picture. This is Aunt Blanche's picture of those hospital buildings. You can actually take a tour of those hospital buildings now. They were very advanced for their age, for the time period. And the US folks are raising money to to restore some of the hospital buildings. And here they are. These are Aunt Blanche's friends. They hated those uniforms, and I can see why. To me, they're not terribly attractive. Terribly attractive. I think they were gray colored even. And this is half of the picture of the nurses who went. Aunt Blanche is the person, the very front row in the white dress and the black hat. So she's there, and you can see the rest of them. And I mean, to me, they look like just ordinary women, sort of your aunts and your grandmothers and your mothers. But yeah, this is a picture of the nurses who went with Aunt Blanche over to France. So the next day they had breakfast at a restaurant. They had roll call. They missed the boat to the dance at night. Lots of dances, lots of fun. I mean, these are young women from rural Ontario who ended up in New York City and were being paid for it. So they had their uniforms, the other uniforms fitted today, and they were very pretty. And there's the uniform that they liked better. And they had a white working uniform. This was their dress uniform, and they had a gray working uniform. And the only other piece that added with this were the blue cape with the red flannel lining. So the nurses looked pretty, the nurses were happy. Actually, some of the British and the Canadian nurses thought the US nurses' uniforms were more desirable. Okay, so now we're at the middle of September. So they've been in New York City for a couple of weeks. I stayed in all day. They've been here for 2 weeks and still no signs of leaving. Starting to get a little bit antsy. Now, 2 weeks later, we're into October. We're still here. Will we ever go? We were paid today. We all feel like millionaires with $50. And a group of them went over to New York City and they bought blue silk blouses. That was in another note. October 4th, they went to Child's for breakfast. Child's, I think, is the very first fast food restaurant in the whole world. But they were talking about going on a parade. So they marched in this parade, and I've got a picture of the parade. Great crowds and a fine day. And here's a picture of the parade. This was a political parade. The US really didn't want, not everyone in the United States wanted the US to be in the war. So this parade, I think, went on for 5 hours. You can see this is the row after row after row of nurses in their white uniforms. And it really was quite effective, I think, in helping sway some of the opinion towards being more favorable towards the First World War. Okay, well, now we're in the middle of October. No sailing orders yet. Guess we're here for the winter. Wish I could go home. No mail for a week from there. So I think she's starting to get a little bit homesick. Okay, now we're towards the end of October. So just every time I look at the water, I wonder why I left home. Again, that looks like she's getting homesick. And, you know, she grew up right beside Lake Erie, so I think water was incredibly important to her. We're now in the middle of November. Unit 1 sailed today. That hospital sailed. How we envied them. They say, though, that we're going to be the next unit to go. November 21st, we're getting towards the US Thanksgiving. And she says, at last I have something to write about. Received her orders and we're sailing tomorrow. We're going to be leaving. Such excitement. And here it is. Yes, they did go. Our last breakfast at Ellis Island, and probably our last for a long time. Such a horrid rainy day. Typical diary. Lots of talk. Diaries aren't always all that interesting. Quite often they talk about weather and what they had for dinner, that sort of things. And we had to dig a fair bit to find out what was actually going on. We had to look at dates and try and correlate dates with dates of what was happening in the war with what was in Aunt Blanche's diary to sort of figure out what was going on. So they left the island on a small ferry and were taken to Jersey Terminal where the rest of our unit, all of the other, the officers and the enlisted men, for the first time they met them. Okay, this is the boat they went across on, the Carpathian. Those of you, I'm sure there's historians in your group, but the Carpathian was the ship that picked up a lot of the Titanic survivors. So everyone thought the Carpathian was a really quite a lucky ship, although a couple of years later it was sunk in the war. So that's the boat she went in. The doctors and the dentists, of course, the officers got the better cabins. The nurses got the next cabin, but the rest of the boat was full of the enlisted men, and I think there were some soldiers, but the hospitals were sent before the soldiers were sent. So hospitals and money got sent first, soldiers got sent later. Okay, 23rd, we slept fairly well. They're on the boat. Quite a number of the nurses are ill. It looks like seasickness. And they had to close the portholes at night. A lot. There were ships that were sunk, so they had to have their life vests with them, their life belts with them at that time, at all times, and they had to sleep with their portholes closed. So 23rd of November, they slept until 8. The stewardesses brought their breakfast, and they arrived in Halifax. So they went to Halifax, and Halifax was where the convoys were put together. It was a lot safer for groups of ships to go across the Northern Atlantic. So they went to Halifax to be put together with their convoy. And it looks like she quite liked Halifax. I mean, I quite like Halifax too. Quaint little houses built on hillsides. November 26th, it's very cold, below zero. They're out on the ocean. They saw their first snow. And they're talking about they can see the other boats. It's a consolation to know that we're not alone out there. Oh, what a lonesome feeling. And here's a picture of what they would have seen going across, quite close to the other ships, and a pretty choppy sea for sure. So they're moving right along. The last of November, they say we're going to land Wednesday or Thursday next week. But they're now within striking distance of Britain. So striking distance where the German submarines were within reach. It's quite warm, but a very rough night at sea. How the old ship pitches back and forth. So yeah, and they're going to have a gale, and they're unable to stay outside, and they can hardly wait till they reach land. And sounds, from what I can see there, she's homesick again. And this is kind of interesting that they saw their first destroyer today, and it looked mighty good. But they also heard about Halifax disaster. They missed the explosion in Halifax Harbor by just a couple of days. It was just an incredible explosion. And here's just one picture of the devastation that the munitions ship that exploded in the Halifax Harbor. Okay, December 8th, we're all out on the deck, such crowds of soldiers of all nationalities. She says she's homesick for the first time. I think reading between the lines, I think she was homesick before then. So they landed, they were put on a train, and then they were sent up to London. They arrived in London in wee small hours of the morning. They stayed overnight. Of course, they went to Buckingham Palace. They went and saw Westminster Abbey, and then they left to go up to Southampton to get across the across to France. And when they were waiting to get on the boat to go across, this is the hotel they stayed in. I mean, that's not exactly what they're going to see once they get to France, but there it is. That building is still there. It's actually being used as a university residence right now. But that's where the nurses and the doctors and the officers were located. And okay, they get across the channel. They're now on a train that's taking them clear across to Vitel, right across France. My husband and I took the train across France to go to Vitel in 2018, 100 years after Aunt Blanche went. And it was completely different when we were going across than what she describes here. They're munching hardtack and beef bully. They rush madly out to try and get a cup of horrible black coffee. Aunt Blanche was, she probably saw things kind of the glass half empty rather than half full. At least that's my recollection of her. She talked about passing a section where our Princess Pats fell, and was quite depressing to see the little wooden crosses along the roadside. It's growing colder every minute. And I actually brought a picture of a war cemetery, a very recent war cemetery. It doesn't look like the kind of war cemeteries that we think with neat rows of crosses, but this is what they would have seen from their train window. This kind of little cemetery. Okay, when they got to Vitel, Vitel is a spa town, and it was actually going to house 2 hospital complexes. So Buffalo had a hospital there, and the city of Detroit, with their Wayne State University Medical School, had a hospital. So it wasn't just sort of an 8 to 1,500 bed hospital complex. It was actually 2 1,500 bed complexes, almost 3,000 beds. And then about 2 miles from this Vitel, there were another 2 hospitals. So within 2 miles, there were 4 hospital sites of about 6,000 beds. They had beautiful hotels and lovely villas, and we're going to be, yes, I think the next picture is, yes, here we go. This is a picture of Vitel back about the time of the First World War. You can see the little village at the back is a very old village. I think Joan of Arc's aunt lived in this village, lots of history. The bigger buildings at the front are the spa buildings. This Vitel Water comes from there. Nestle's actually owns the Vitel Water Company. The spa buildings were started in the early 1800s. Beautiful buildings, lots of them. It's actually a Club Med site now. So most of the buildings are still there. The only trouble, it was a summer resort, so there really was very limited heating, and certainly not a lot of insulation or double paned windows. So you hear a lot of complaining about the cold in my aunt's diary. So yeah, Vitel, France, it was a spa center. Goes back centuries. It's a very old town, and it was 30 to 40 miles from the fighting front. They actually could hear, almost constantly, they could hear the guns. And the site was basically unchanged since the 1880s. And I think you could say that now too. This is a picture of the doctors and the nurses in front of the casino building. You can see there's not too many doctors, and there sure aren't very many nurses. Aunt Blanche again is the one with the arrow. Because these buildings were so beautiful, and the site is absolutely astounding. U.S. National Library of Medicine and the U.S. Library of Congress sent photographers over, and there are many, many pictures of this hospital because of the site. So if any of you want to see pictures of the hospital site, you actually can get at those at the Library of Congress. So this is one of the hospital buildings. The nurses lived in here for a little while. So this is the hospital building in 1918. And this is the same building in 2018. And you can see it's very little changed. And that's where my husband and I stayed when we were in Vital. It's fascinating though. It ended up that George and I knew far more about the hospital site than anyone we found in Vital. Vital was really not all that interested in the history around the hospital site. Okay, here's another one of the buildings that was turned into a hospital. Okay, and you can see that huge building at the back. That's actually one big hotel, and it's still there as part of the Club Med site. And I don't know if you can see all of the boxes and all of the trains and whatnot. Because Detroit got to this village first, they took the big hotel, and you can see them trying to get all of this stuff up into the hospital to get it ready. When the hospitals moved into these sites, quite often they needed a lot of cleaning up, a lot of prep before they could actually get to having patients. And actually the folks in Vital, the Buffalo Hospital, had it quite nice. A lot of other places didn't have the kind of facilities. This is a picture of the New Zealand hospital, and you can see they lived in Quonset huts. Some of the hospital sites across France were in casinos, some of them were in monasteries, some of them were in racetracks, if you can imagine. But I think that Kingston Hospital was the one that takes the cake. They actually, their whole hospital time was spent in tents. So it was a whole winter that they ran hospitals out of tents. So Buffalo was a lot easier than Kingston. Okay, December 20th. Remember they left Wainfleet or Buffalo in August, and here it is just about Christmas. They have their trunks and our duffel bags, and we're going to try to keep warm. And our meals are horrible. That sounds like Aunt Blanche, but we hope to have our own mess soon. We had a lovely walk, could hear the guns. And the hospital folks in Buffalo actually made good friends with the village people. There was lots of interaction between the hospital and the village. With wartime hospitals, they're either bored silly or they're worked right off their feet. And it looks like right now, again, they still don't have patients. So 25th of December, it's Christmas Day and she's homesick. They went to the officers' party, and then they spent some time with the village children. I'm wondering what they're doing at home today, and not too happy with Christmas dinner. January 5th, the wretched night. The girls are going out to dinner tonight and have champagne in our rooms after. For once in our lives, we've had all the champagne we wanted. And this actually was a bit of a revelation for me. My family, bless their hearts, or however you want to put it, they were very big in the temperance movement. And to hear Aunt Blanche talk about having all the champagne she wanted was, it gave me a new perspective on her. Okay, January 16th, they still don't have patients, but she's in the hot supply room. Nothing of importance happened today. So they're getting ready. They're getting ready for patients, but they haven't got patients yet. So January the 17th, Ann Austin, the woman who sent my mother the diary, was feeling better, but Aunt Blanche was in the supply room. She's on duty in the supply room the next day until 4 p.m. And she said it's horribly monotonous work. And on January the 19th, on Saturday, they made supplies all day. And here's the supply room. This is the picture from the US Library of Congress of the actual supply room. And yeah, they had to keep this, the nurses had to keep this full. Okay, 29th of January. So they had a fire. They did a lot of their heating. They didn't have furnaces and whatnot. They had kerosene stoves, and fire was always a problem. And this sentence is one that I really felt did come from my aunts. Yes, she said, it's quite a, yes, for once we were glad we're in a damp building. We were too wet to burn. So January the 30th, now they're making beds. The supply room is taken care of. The 30th of January, they're making beds. They went to church and came home for a wonderful dinner, went to the movies in the evening, and 2 letters from home. Okay, now she's marking linen. They went out in the park and gathered pussy willows. A beautiful day. The shrubbery is coming out in bud. Remember, we're now in the middle of February. They had left Buffalo in August. Marked linen in the morning. Wonders of wonders, we're going to have patience tomorrow. Hurry up and wait. So it was a 6-month rush. No mail tonight. And they said there was a tank had been seen, but it's still another beautiful Monday. So they're getting ready for patience. So I'm going to digress a little bit. I put these pictures in just to explain to people how the hospitals, how did the patients get from the front line to those spa buildings? There's a map of the front line, the big heavy wiggly line. The straight lines are actually railway lines, and you can see a lot of the railway lines went right to Vitel. They would bring the soldiers by train to the hospital in Vitel. Of course, here's one of the nicer pictures I could find about trench warfare. My grandchildren love this picture because they like the mud for sure. So if you were wounded out on the battle, you were brought into a dressing station or a casualty clearing station. You were assessed. If you could be patched up, you were patched up and then sent back into the trenches. If you needed to go further, they then took you, here's your casualty clearing station. They would take you to a tent and you would get a little bit more treatment. And then again, if you were patched up, you got sent back. If you needed further treatment, you were put on a hospital train. These hospital trains were purpose-built, really quite comfortable. They were the three levels. And this is the first time that some of these men had been in a real bed with heat, decent food, blankets. This was really a lot of the soldiers talked about being in these hospital trains. They had their own physicians, they had their own nurses, they had their own cooks, and wonders of wonders, they had their own lots of heat. And then they came to the train station. I think this might be Vitel, but I could be wrong. And then they were put in those Pierce ambulances and taken to the base hospital. So February the 12th, it's a warm spring day. Looks like they get their spring a little bit further. The countryside around Vitel is very much like the countryside up near Vineland, the sort of rolling hills, lots of grapes and wine making. Yeah, they were up at 4:10. They had breakfast at 4:30. They were on duty at 5, but no patients yet. They had 23 patients were admitted. I feel as though I had a new lease on life when I think about being able to do something. And all nationalities, Belgium, French, Madagascar, and Chinese. Off duty at 2, Lincoln's birthday. and she and one of her friends went out to celebrate. Now, Aunt Blanche doesn't talk much about the realities of what she saw. So this next two slides are going to talk about this is a direct quote from a nurse who was in the Detroit hospital. So this is the same city. But this is what she said. Huge camions rumble back and forth. So we realized that there was going to be activity on the lines. We soon received our first convoy of wounded American soldiers. How they were cut, slashed, and shot to pieces. Bursting shells I cannot describe. Ambulance load after ambulance load drove up to the hospitals. I, for one, can never forget that shriek and the rolls of ambulances back and forth, bearing the loads of mutilated men. It all seemed so barbarous. Stretcher after stretcher was unloaded again. Yeah, it was really quite brutal when they were working with the soldiers. It was quite brutal, quite varied too. Only about half of the cases that they saw were actual war wounds. The other half were gas cases, probably even more with shell shock or PTSD, lots of communicable diseases. In one place, Aunt Blanche talked about having a ward full of 200 men with mumps, if you can imagine. So the doctors and the nurses were kept quite busy, looking at a fair number of different conditions. Nancy was bombed today. Nancy was the big French city that was fairly close. And this to me is probably the most poignant of all of the entries in Aunt Blanche's diary. She's saying, how I wish the folks at home could see us. Then they would envy us instead of pity us. So I think Aunt Blanche felt strongly that she was doing good work despite being homesick, but she really truly felt that she was doing good work. Quite a heavy snowfall again. The hills are wonderful. Ada, Evelyn, and I played fox and geese and made a snow race. You'll see in this diary that Aunt Blanche and the nurses spent a fair bit of time together. Nurses traditionally in the army it's been kind of a funny relationship. The nurses were sort of considered officers. They weren't given that rank necessarily, but they were considered to be officers. And if you were an officer, you could only hang out, interact with other officers. You couldn't socialize with the enlisted men, the orderlies and the cooks and whatnot. But the doctors and the dentists were usually quite a bit older. A lot of them were married. A lot of them looked down their noses at nursing. Nursing wasn't didn't have quite the cachet that nursing does now. So the nurses actually had kind of a lonely life. They relied on letters, their friends, their nursing friends, and lots of going out for walks in the forest, interaction with the children of the village. And I can remember playing fox and geese in the snow. So yeah, things change, but they don't change. Okay, March the 5th, they admitted 300 patients, lots of confusion. March the 26th, they say this is the greatest battle of the war. The German armies, the German and the Hungarian, the German and the Turkish forces knew that the American soldiers would be here soon. So what they tried to do is this operation, Michelle, they tried to break the line before the American soldiers came. They say the patients are depressed, their leave's been taken away, and they go directly from the hospitals to the front. My heart aches for them. So the hospitals were getting ready for a big onslaught of patients. And this is a picture of the Germans going out. You can just see man after man after man. So these are the Germans going out to fight this operation, Michelle. and they desperately wanted to break the line. They tried really hard, but they did not break the line. And by then, the American soldiers started to arrive. Early hours, Martha and I went to the woods for flowers. We had a wonderful walk over the hills. We came home and made candy for the patients. Gas drill this afternoon. Oh, the horrible things. Supposedly should be mighty glad to have them. The gases, there were, I think, 3 or 4 or 5 different kinds of gases, and every one of them was absolutely brutal. Here's a picture of the German army getting ready to release the gas. I don't know which gas it was, phosgene or chlorine, but here's a picture of the getting ready to release the gases and hoping that the wind will deliver them where they wanted to be delivered. And here's a picture of the soldiers wearing gas masks, and you can see that the dogs are wearing gas masks too. Dogs were incredibly important to the people the men in the trenches. They offered them some companionship and some warmth. They also kept the rats down. So not only did the men have gas masks, but the dogs had gas masks too. And here's a picture of some Australian soldiers who had been hurt by the gas attacks, and they're just waiting for some treatment. I don't think it's at Aunt Blanche's hospital, but Aunt Blanche's hospital in Vital certainly had lots of patients with gas injuries. Okay, April Fool's Day. No mail today. She was off duty from 10 to 4. So they're working 18-hour days with work for 18 hours and 6 hours off. But they still had time to go to a dance. Well, most of them went to the dance, but Aunt Blanche didn't go to the dance. But I can't imagine working 18 hours with patients, having 6 off, and then coming back on. Letter from home. Talking about Canadians being drafted. What will they do at home? My grandfather was the only son of a farmer, so he actually was not drafted. He managed to stay on the farm. They admitted 300 new patients, but nobody was all that ill in June. In July, she's on duty. Our patients, they now had 1,500 patients. 60 some nurses to look after 1,500 patients was really quite a load. Aunt Blanche talks about how the wounded soldiers actually helped other wounded soldiers. So the soldiers really were quite helpful. The patients were, where they could, were very helpful with the other patients. And got some pictures of the hospital buildings where they were. Lovely open spaces, but I can't imagine trying to heat that. Here's a picture of one of the, I don't know if it's a ballroom or not, but it's certainly one of the rooms in one of the big hotels, the spa hotels. And you could see at the very front, there's a kerosene heater, and that's the only heat for that big space. And here's another picture with the patients in the sunroom. You can see lots of bandages, but I can't imagine trying to heat that space. I guess I'm thinking about all the snow that's come down those last couple of days, but that just kind of makes me shiver. And here's one of the pictures from the Library of Congress. I'm not sure all of the patients were quite that happy, but you can see some of the grounds. The grounds are just absolutely astounding. Just a beautiful, beautiful place to have this horrid, so much pain and suffering. And here's another picture. The residents of the village and surrounding towns came and helped. You can see the one fellow has lost his leg and lots of other injuries, but again, they look fairly happy. Okay, here's the records room. I teach a course or taught a course in medical records at McMaster, and yes, still doing paper charts in a lot of places 100 years later. So in July, she says, I'm in the Quinbrine room, many badly burned cases. I'm not crazy about it. And I can't say as I blame her, burns are not nice. In August, now she's in the orthopedic ward. She's out to dinner with Ed and Tommy again at one of the other buildings. And turns out Ed is her her beau. We decided to go public. It's too public place, still busy at the hospital, but the work is interesting and the boys are great. So she has a secret relationship with this fellow. He was from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He was a non-commissioned officer, so she was not supposed to be seen with him. I think he was in the records office, but there he is. That's Ed. That's the love of her life. And I had never seen that side of my aunt. So, I mean, it was just a real reckoning to see that kind of. Okay, many new patients, quite a number of Germans. We're on into September. We're getting towards the close of the war. The Aunt Blanche's hospital were very good at treating the people in the village. They were also very good at treating the prisoners of war. Lots of prisoners of war were treated at this hospital. September 14th, very busy. They're operating day and night, so many amputations. And yeah, the surgeries look like slaughterhouses. And that's the closest she's come to actually talking about how tough it was. Miss Voland, I think, is the head nurse. Bright, cool day. September the 2nd. Okay, they had a baseball game. They beat Buffalo. Sorry, they beat Detroit. So they were quite happy they were quite happy to beat the Detroit hospital. And she's saying, altogether, this has been quite a happy year. The head nurse died, and it was quite a shock to the Buffalo people. 2 deaths in the unit in 1 week, both from pneumonia. The Canadians lost nurses in the First World War with war wounds, but the US nurses did not die from any war injuries, but lots of pneumonia and other infectious diseases. Here's a picture of the staff of the hospital going at the funeral for the person who died in the Detroit hospital. And that's our hotel in the back. And we walked under that bridge a fair bit of the time when we went into the town from the spa buildings. Okay, end of September, many new patients, several very sick with pneumonia. Now here's another battle. This is a battle of the St. Quentin Canal. I think this was one of the last big battles. They knew the war was ending, but there were still big battles. And I don't know if you can see it or not, but each one of those white dots is a soldier, and they had to go down, cross the river, and then back up. So it was quite a brutal one, and lots of patients in the hospitals. October 15th, they're talking about peace talks. And here Ed shows up again. We have a bet with him that we won't be home before June of 1919. November the 11th, the war is over. The armistice is signed. Yeah, the papers are signed. So that was in November. Now we switch all the way over to February, payday, and our buildings are being closed. The hospitals couldn't leave, immediately when the war was over. They had to deal with all of their patients. They had to close up the hospital. So our buildings are being closed today, and we cease to be a base. All the records are sent, and we await our orders. Can it actually be true? So a little bit of data on the base hospital in Buffalo. They their hospital included 21 buildings. They treated pretty close to 12,000 patients, and they had a very low death rate. But the death rates, if you're going to die, quite often you died before you got to the hospital. But they prided themselves in having one of the lowest death rates around. Okay, now she's on the boat home. This is March. So the war was over in November, but she's on the boat home in March. She left on the 6:25 train to get to the harbor. Monday, April the 7th, they're getting ready to sail. We're all filled with excitement. They can't believe they're actually going home. This is the boat they were on. This is actually a picture, one of my Aunt Blanche's pictures. They played bridge, quite cold, calm sea. Think of it, we'll be in New York in the morning. We made 405 miles since yesterday. Hope to be home in a few days. And there's Ed again, and it's foggy. So Thursday, the 17th of April, this is again Aunt Blanche's photo of the Statue of Liberty. The last entry was, she said, we docked at 6 p.m. And that's the end of the diary. They were celebrated when they came home, but like a lot of soldiers, it was very difficult. Some people found it difficult to get back into life, into civilian life. Aunt Blanche took some courses in public health, which were funded by the U.S. government. This is a celebration of them once they got back. Lots of honors. The nurses were given a lot of honors, both Canadian nurses by the Canadian authorities and U.S. nurses by and the British quite appreciated their nurses too, for sure. This is a fellow she married, Albert Irving Hawke. She didn't marry him until she'd been home for 10 years. There were no children in the family. This fellow was a very skilled machinist, very classy fellow. You can see he wore a tie even when he was in his machine shop. She kept very close contact with her nursing colleagues. And this is a picture from the 1950s. Aunt Blanche is the one in the dark dress with the pearls. But I mean, look at those women. Those women could be our grandmothers. I mean, yeah, the nurses went through a lot, and they really stayed close. And there she is at her house. Her house is still standing. Yeah, I gained a real appreciation for who she was. In growing up, she was kind of gruff and demanding. I learned how to do hospital corner bed making by the time I was 6. But yeah, this is a nice picture of her. And as I say, I certainly gained a real appreciation for who she was and the history that she had. And just to end up, this is all I could find in France that talked about the hospital that had been in this town. And not only had the hospital been in that town in Vital in 1919, Buffalo also sent a hospital to the same spot in the Second World War. Okay, so Amanda, that's all I've got. You got time for questions, I guess?
Yep, sorry, it took a second to unmute there. Yes, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. And it's funny that you talk about the nurses and how they remain close. I actually have an aunt who gets together every year with the class of nurses that she graduated with in the 60s. So I think that may be something that's unique to that particular profession, that they tend to group together and stay together. And I mean, my aunt knows nurses up and down Ontario. So fascinating. We've got a whole bunch of comments here, and I'm just going to say again, if you have a question, I'm sorry. I know we're a little bit over time.
Sorry.
It's, It's okay. It's absolutely, we're only a couple minutes over. And again, because we started a few minutes late, so we're absolutely fine. I'm just trying to pull up. I did see there was a message there from a woman named Diane Reed, who says that she's your fifth cousin. So she's asked me to pass on her email to you. I've already done that, so you can connect with her. Um, I've got a lot of comments in here. Loved it, says Susan Quirk. My mother-in-law was a nurse in the Korean War.
Oh my.
Um, Wonderful. I can't, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know why it's not scrolling for me. Lois, are you able to scroll? I can't get up the comments. Sorry. Oh, there we go. I don't know why it's going so slow for me. I did see someone say, and I agree, the pictures were absolutely amazing. You've done some amazing work in pulling all of the information together. I could just, as someone who's done research on her own family, see how you can go through the information and then you want to find out at each point, well, what did this look like? And how was this? And what did it look like then? And what does it look like now? So that was absolutely amazing.
Let me just jump in. My family decided that we wanted to share all of Aunt Blanche's things, and rather than put them in somebody's drawer, we gave them all to the University of Buffalo.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
So it's all there.
Yeah, and Annette says it's great to have the actual diary entries. It really brings the experience to life.
One other comment, there were many hospitals sent by French Canadian nurses too, and you can find out about that in the Montreal City Archives site. So
Yes.
Yeah, and again, as Amanda says, lots of fantastic comments, and it was fantastic.
Thanks, Lois. Did I miss anything else? No? All right.
If anyone wants my email, I'm sure Amanda can give it to you. And thank you for letting me share this story. I mean, ancestors are incredibly rich people, and we just need to know more.
Oh, are you still there?
Yes.
Sorry, it seemed to, I don't know what happened there. It just kicked me off completely. Place pin. There we go. No, that's not what I want. I'm just going to put you up there. That's fine. Sorry, did you, what was it you were saying?
I had just said that all the material we had on Aunt Blanche is in the Buffalo University of Buffalo archives.
Oh, perfect. And now my screen, I don't know what happened. It must have just reset my program for some reason there. Oh, Iola Whiteside says it was very interesting. My cousin Ruth Dawn from Grey County was one of the $10 a month Canadian nurses. Beverly says my great aunt Maud Sterling was a nursing sister in World War I, and she received the Royal Red Cross Medal for bravery. Mary Bronson says wonderful presentation. I loved all the photos and the diary. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Yes, Kathy, we do plan on posting for the members. And I'm just going to take a second, since I've got the opportunity, to say it is membership season. We do appreciate your support. If you are a member of the OGS, just remember to tick the Niagara and join the Niagara region or peninsula when you renew your membership. Also, if you have not signed up for our newsletter, you can go to our website, niagara.ogs.on.ca, and sign up right on the front page for our newsletter. And you can stay tuned for our upcoming speakers, who are as wonderful as Anne. And also, we've got for our members the availability of some of our digital publications that make great holiday gifts. So if you want to point your loved ones towards the website and say, this is what I want for Christmas, then this is the time to do it. And I am just going to stop here and say, and thank you it was an absolutely, it's overwhelming the amount of information you've pulled up, and just amazing that you were able to provide this information to our group. We really appreciate you joining us for today. And I do see one more comment. Vicky says, thanks very much. A distant cousin of mine, Annie Jane Hartley, was a matron in the First World War. She also received the Royal Red Cross in Bar. I was mentioned in dispatches. So it was good to see the ladies' stories are finally being told. And that's part of it too, that sometimes, we think, when we think of Remembrance Day, we think of the soldiers themselves, and they weren't the only ones who were affected by the war. So thank you very much for bringing this story to us. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. And sorry for being a little bit late.
No worries.